Hi, this is Scott Houston and welcome to Learning with Power. This is episode number 31 and it's the, I guess, much anticipated The World in 3000 BC. I know I had said it was going to be 3500, but I decided to make it 3000. Alright, so basically, in keeping with this series, we're going to be in a little time machine, and the time machine is going to be going, and we're going to land in 3000 BC. And this time machine can also take us all around the world. So think of like Cosmos, when Neil deGrasse Tyson had you in a little machine, and they could travel all over space and time. We're just traveling around the Earth in a given time. So we're in 3000 BC, and we're going to take our craft and we're going to land in ancient Sumer, where we have the Sumerians. And the reason why I decided to pick 3000 BC as the next time that we visit is because this is when really writing appears. And once you have writing, then that is the beginning of history. And so anything before that is prehistoric, like me. But this is the beginning of history. And so actually, you know, writing in Sumer, the Sumerians, really began around 3200 BC. You can have cuneiform tablets that are as old as that, but around 3000 it was really common at that point. And they were writing to the extent of where you could actually identify their language, which other forms of writing you couldn't necessarily do at this time. And so it really was the cutting edge of writing technology at this time. But not a whole lot was being depicted as far as historical events. And so we don't really, even though history began because we have writing, we don't really have the depiction of a whole lot of historical events yet. You know, those start to happen later. And so we'll go back to Sumer, which is basically in present-day Iraq now. Okay, so, and that's really the oldest established civilization in the world. And there were 6 places where civilization established very early on. But at 3000 BC, there were around 4, actually. There were 4 civilizations. 4 of the 6. So number 1 is Sumer. Number 2 is Egypt. Egypt was established before all these others established. And you have an Egyptian civilization, you know, in like Memphis, things like that, when what's called pre-dynastic. And then you have what's called early dynastic, and that starts around 3000 BC, and that's when you see them start to build the pyramids and things like that. And that's really when hieroglyphics come to be. So like now I don't have any more about hieroglyphics, but they start around that time. But again, even with hieroglyphics, even though we now can translate the hieroglyphics thanks to the Rosetta Stone, discovered by Napoleon's men, we still don't really know exactly what it sounded like. Whereas with the Sumerians, we do have an idea of what their language probably sounded like, and we also have a sense of grammar. And grammar, as a concept, did not exist until there was writing. And so that actually affected the way people spoke to each other. So until there was writing, you have people speaking to each other in very simplistic ways and very simplistic sentences and with no structure of any type. You know, it was like, you know, I, food, want, you know, that kind of thing. And that was how people talked in those days. They didn't actually say those words because that's English, but you get the idea. But then when you have writing, then you start to have actual grammar, and you have some sophisticated grammar, concepts. You have things like prepositional phrases and conjunctions and complex sentences and things like that. And we start to see a little bit of that in ancient cuneiform with the Sumerians. All right, so the second place, and we'll get back to that, like I said. And so the second place, like I said, is Egypt. And we have in 3000 BC, we have what's called the early dynastic period, which really is like when Egypt really starts to shine, and they're building the pyramids and things like that. Now, obviously, Egyptian civilization started, around 4300 BC. So, in a way, that predates the Sumerians, but the Sumerians evolved in such a way that by 3000 BC, they actually had a more sophisticated civilization, somewhat more sophisticated than did the Egyptians at that time. So number 3 actually is the Indus Valley. And we're talking about the early Harappan period. And again, the early Harappan period begins around 3300 BC. But by 3000, you've got cities and stuff established. So let's talk a little bit about the Indus Valley before we go back to Sumeria. So, like I said, we have the Harappan dynasty, and we have the establishment of actual cities at this point, around 3000 BC in the Indus Valley. Now, the Indus Valley today is in present-day southern Pakistan. And we're talking about Pakistan proper, not East Pakistan that became Bangladesh later on, but actual Pakistan is to the northwest part of India. It also goes into the northwest part of India as well. But there's 2 major settlements, or even cities. They were basically cities, and it's called Mohenjo-Daro is one of those cities. In Sumer, we have a city called Uruk. Okay. And so you've got a lot of innovations in the Indus Valley, but a lot of things really do parallel what was happening with the Sumerians in Sumer. And one of the reasons why and also in ancient Sumer, you can find evidence of a lot of trade happening between Sumer and the Indus Valley. Like in the Indus Valley, they made a lot of textiles, like these little ornate, or I guess pretty little beads, glass beads, and you find them in settlements or in archaeological digs in Sumer or in southern Iraq. And so we know that trade was going on, and actually, so when those places were originally established, there was maybe only about 1,500 kilometers, which is maybe 1,000 miles, between the 2 places, which is not really that far. But that now is further today because the sea level has gone up, and it's actually taken away a lot of the coastal land, and it's actually made it a longer trip now to go from that area over to southern Iraq. And water management had a lot to do with why these civilizations started to evolve in the first place. So, for thousands and thousands of years, many thousands of years, like we discussed in previous lectures, you've got people just being nomadic herders wandering around. And, life was good, everything was fruits and vegetables and animals were aplenty. And so civilization was hard to undertake, and you had to have some profound motivation to do that. And one of the things that happened was, especially with the Indus Valley, it seems that there was some climate change that was happening. And that was forcing people to come out of the mountains and kind of converge in the valley areas. And water became more scarce. And so they needed to sort of work together and manage and manipulate the water. And these sorts of profound changes is partly what led to civilization. Either the game, like in North America, was dying off, or like I said, water was becoming more scarce, things like that. I mean, there were reasons why you couldn't just wander around anymore. You had to get together. You had to have organized, unified sort of projects now. And so one of the things that they did in the Indus Valley that was pretty impressive was what they call, what we would call urban planning. So it didn't just build up one building and another building. They actually kind of planned how the city was going to kind of look, which was pretty cool. And they also built a lot of non-residential buildings, but they did not build big palaces like they usually did in most places. They also did not really build religious things, temples and things like that, which is ironic because most places evolved from religious places. And so initially you've got this place where people would gather from miles around, like Stonehenge, and they would pray at this in one particular area, maybe for a big event, maybe a week-long event, and then maybe they would disperse after that. And so those areas eventually became, like at Göbekli Tepe and places like that, became like civilization areas. So as people started to congregate more, there were some people that stayed there like year-round and things like that, or they built things and people stayed there to kind of keep an eye on stuff. And so most places really evolved, because of religion, but not apparently in the Indus Valley, which is sort of ironic because today, especially in India, you've got more different religions than anywhere else, and it really is all about religion. And certainly in Pakistan it's all about religion, but there it's all about one religion. But maybe it's because, in a way, the people are the same because people had religion obviously at that time, but I think people were more, or it seems to be that people were more private and just practiced it within their own dwellings and things like that, and not at big public places. And so there was maybe lots of different interpretations of God or the gods or whatever, whereas in India that still exists because there's more different religions being practiced in India than anywhere else in the world. And so anyway, so the cities like Mohenjo-Daro had about maybe 50,000 people in the city, but in the general area was about 5 million. So that in the general area that supported the valley and that supported the civilization, there was about 5 million people all participating, which is a pretty significant population center. And so also people were dying though, because water was drying up and stuff, people were dying, and actually that population had dwindled when it first started to get settled and then built back up again once they started to establish this civilization. Now, writing also existed in the Indus Valley, and it appeared around the same time as it did in Sumer. But unfortunately, the Indus script that it's called is still undeciphered. We still don't really know what it says, and it doesn't seem to be a complex grammar or anything like that. So it's more similar to like the ancient writing in China and things like that. And we'll get to that later. But so basically in China you've got, they were writing on oracle bones now, but not at this time. That didn't happen until later, but the first writing in China, they were writing on oracle bones. And so this wasn't exactly, so think of like Twitter, like tweets, on the oracle bones. So this isn't the Epic of Gilgamesh, like what they found in Sumer. But they weren't writing big epics in the Indus Valley either. But they did definitely have a system of writing, and mostly it was a system of like record keeping. And so you've got these like clay tablets and stuff, which you can also find in the Indus Valley, a similar type of thing. Or I mean in Sumer, a similar type of thing. But there's like these little clay, like square tablets with some writing on it and some symbols that were like for like keeping track of like, so for the purpose of doing trade. And so maybe it kept track of like how much grain was in the sack or something like that, and it would be kind of written on a little chip, you could call it. They also built walled settlements, and so that was kind of a new thing, was to build up walls. And the Indus Valley had a tremendous trade network, and it was really an integral part of the civilization, was having this trade network. So they were not isolated just unto themselves. They were sending people out, and they were doing a lot of trade. Like I said, we have a lot of evidence of things coming from there that we find in ancient Sumer now. Another thing that they did in the Indus Valley, like they did in Sumer, is cattle domestication, and that was an important thing. And all right, so that's basically the Indus Valley. And so now we go to Sumer, and so there's a lot of things that they were doing in Sumer too, and actually they have the most sophisticated development of all these things. So they have, and we can tell because their system of writing was a little bit more sophisticated, and so they had developed a well-developed system of law. They had an idea, some basic science was established, and you could see that they had math, which they were doing in the Indus Valley too, obviously, because they were counting things. But they had a type of math, and like what also the Greeks were doing, and they were building things mostly out of reed. But they were also using these amazing, it's called irioi or something. They're blue tiles. So like when you go into Uruk, there was this huge arch basically that you had to walk through. You know, through the city wall that was built. That was all this blue tile goes around this archway that goes into the city. And it's really impressive, and they've rebuilt it now, and they've also rebuilt it on like movie sets and things like that. But you can always recognize ancient Uruk from this blue tile like archway that you see people going into. This great grand entrance, but there they did have temples. You have Ishtar was a god, and it was a polytheistic religion. We know. Like I said, Uruk was the first place. We also saw that they had invented alcohol, that they had invented the wheel, and they also were the first people to divide time into increments of 60, which we still use today. So we can thank the ancient Sumerians for that. Also, in the Bible, Abraham, in the ancient Bible, the historical, which we think Abraham is a historical person. We do think that. And so also in the Old Testament, we have Abraham. It's also the Jews believe in Abraham. And he came from the city of Ur, which is another city that was in ancient Sumer, or the Sumerian civilization, the Sumerian Empire. And he kind of came up with, or we think that he sort of came up with the idea of monotheism, which he brought then to Palestine. And so we kind of attribute that to there. So why did it fall? Why did their civilization fall down when it seemed to be really prosperous? And again, it survived for really thousands of years, because Nebuchadnezzar is like around 600 BC, and he was like the greatest, leader that everybody associates with Sumer, but still he's much later. And he's talked about by Herodotus and people like that, some of the ancient chroniclers and stuff. But what eventually caused the civilization to decline was there was too much crop cultivation, which caused desertification of the area, and turned it into a desert, which it is today. And so it quickly developed into a very sophisticated city, and because it was such a nice city, actually grew too fast, and they got too big for their britches, you could say. Okay, so going back now to the third place that was settled, actually number 3. Well, we talked about Egypt, right? We talked about ancient Egypt, and Egypt's number 2 actually. So Sumer and then Egypt, as far as how developed the civilizations were in 3000 BC. And what we think Egypt, what caused Egypt to emerge as a civilization was, again, climate change. That was causing the land to become, desertification, and then you just have the area along the Nile now, which was very, 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 very fertile, and you could grow things along the Nile, but only really along the Nile. So that kind of forced people to all congregate and live along the Nile, and so that sort of created that reason for that civilization to emerge. And Egypt is what's considered to be the very first nation state. So they realized that we were a nation, and they would fight with each other. And so Upper and Lower Egypt eventually were joined, and they were like, we're Egyptians, and we're a nation. And so that's sort of the first country. Whereas the Sumerians never really thought of themselves as like, I don't think as a country necessarily, or a nation. Even though Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, conquered a huge area, I don't think there wasn't necessarily a country. Whereas in Egypt, they kind of had a sense of a nation, of being a nation. All right, brings us to the next one. So we talked about the Indus Valley, that's number 3. And it brings us to the next one, which is what's called the Caral Supe civilization, which is actually in the coastal area of Peru. And that was actually the next most sophisticated civilization of this time. And they actually had the first city in the Americas, which was called Huaracanga. Was established around 3500 BC, but from 3100 onwards, there was continuous population there. So I mean, it was a city, and the only city in the Americas at the time. And they also had a type of writing in a way. It's called Quipu, Q-U-I-P-U. And it's like string based. So instead of these tiles, these square little tiles, it was used for essentially the same thing. It was used for basically recording and documenting things. But they did it with strings. They tied strings, almost like an abacus, I guess, in a way. And that's called proto-writing. So it's sort of writing, but again, it doesn't really reveal the grammar or how the language would sound, and they weren't like writing stories and novels like the Epic of Gilgamesh with Quipu, with strings. All right, and so like I said, with that type of writing, you can only really convey limited concepts, rather than an entire well-developed language. And certainly they had a language, but that wasn't being expressed with the Quipu. Okay. Brings us to, and so did I cover all those things? Okay, another thing about Sumer is that they had religion, and the religion was very strong, and it was a polytheistic religion, like all religions were. The earliest religions were all polytheistic. Abraham was the exception, so they had rituals like we do today. They had ziggurats, which are like temples, like what we have today, places of worship. They had festivals where everybody would gather, like, every year and at this time of the year, and they would have this big festival, like we do today. And these were religious-based festivals, as far as we can see. And in fact, the whole area pretty much started as a religious center, like I was saying before, like a lot of these places did. And many people think that the Garden of Eden was Mesopotamia, or was in Mesopotamia, or when people write about or talk about in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we talk about the Garden of Eden. Abraham came from Ur. We think that people are probably talking about Mesopotamia at that time, and in a way, it kind of was. Okay. And like I said, they also had cattle domestication there as well. That was a big thing that was going on. Okay, so we left off with, we were still talking about Sumer and the Garden of Eden, and which is mentioned even in the Old Testament and in the Torah for the Jewish religion as well. All right, and so that brings us to the next civilization, which really is the Minoans. They were on the island of Crete, but they did a lot of trade, and so they obviously had ships that they had built, and there's evidence of things that came from the Minoans all over the Grecian islands. And so they did quite a lot of trade, and they were a fairly sophisticated civilization, and we will talk about them later, because they really didn't come to exist until about 2200 BC, so like 800 years later. But one thing that we know for sure about the Minoans is very clearly they were not black. And so all this stuff that I'm reading about recently where they've discovered, and it's like been embraced by the left, and it's like, yes, it must be true. And they discovered that actually in Northern Europe, everybody was black in only 3000 BC. That's a load of crap. Actually, they say 3,000 years ago. That is impossible. That's just not true. It's a fantasy. It's a liberal fantasy. It just didn't happen. They were not. All right, and so that brings us to the last of the 6 original dynasties, which is China. Now, in China, the very first civilization really is called the Xia. It's called the Xia civilization, which started around 2070 BC. And that's any time before that is called the Neolithic period in China. And the first dynasty, or the first real established civilization in China, so the first civilization in China, kind of like what they had in Mesopotamia, wasn't until 1766 BC is when they say that the Shang dynasty actually began, and that was a sophisticated civilization, and they prayed to like a big bull kind of god called Shangdi. In fact, he's called Shangdi because he's from the Shang dynasty. Di meaning god at the time. However, China did have, like I said, a culture around 3500 BC called the Dawenkou, Dawenkou culture, and so the Neolithic culture of China, and ultimately the Dawenkou culture, started around the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. There was some civilization there, and that's where that was developing. And in those places we can find some subterranean houses, like we also find at Lake Göbekli Tepe, for example. And so they're not related at all, but they both have the same idea, which was to build like subterranean houses, which is kind of an interesting thing that early people thought to do that. I guess it's kind of like it was cooler, and or didn't get as hot or as warm, you know, it wasn't as affected by the temperature changes outside, and I guess you kind of get that same effect in caves, you know, when they were cave dwelling before that time. So anyway, you do have what's called the Dawenkou culture around 3000 BC in China. Most of the culture and civilization was centered around the Yellow and the Yangtze River area. And pretty much, I guess that covers it. So those are the 6 major places where civilization began. But in 3000 BC, with our little time machine, we go down to Sumer, which is southern Iraq, and that was a flourishing civilization there. And then we go to basically Memphis, which is near Cairo, present day in Egypt. And that's a pretty sophisticated civilization, not quite as advanced as they were in Mesopotamia, but you know, almost. And it became actually grander eventually. And then you go to the Indus Valley, which is related in some way to the. And actually, they've discovered that ancient people from the Indus Valley are actually, when they do the DNA, they find that they're much more closely related genetically to people from Mesopotamia. So they were sort of very closely related to Mesopotamia. So they had migrated from the west eastward into that valley and settled in that valley, rather than coming from, let's say, more eastern areas like in China and migrating westward. Okay, and so but that's so we go down there, and it's called the early Harappan period there in the Indus Valley, which is basically today Pakistan. And then we take our little ship and go, and we land on the coastal area of Peru, north of Lima, but along the coast, closer to Ecuador, I guess. And we have the Karo Supe civilization and an actual city, you could say, that was called Hurakanga, which is one of the few cities. So there's Hurakanga, there's Memphis in Egypt, there's Uruk and Ur in Mesopotamia, and there's Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. And so those are the cities that were existing now at that time. And so taking our little time machine, and we go to the island of Crete, and we see the beginnings of some civilization happening, but not quite yet. And we go to China, and again we have the Dawankou culture is forming around the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, but not really yet a strong civilization. And in China, writing doesn't actually evolve until around 1250 BC, which is when we can find oracle bones traced back to that time. Okay, so that about covers it. I've purposely made this lecture a little shorter because it seems that people are turned off by the fact that they're too long. But I mean, these are basically designed as being like lectures. Like if you're going to go to university, it's going to be a lecture. And lectures are usually 45 or 50 minutes long, not 30 minutes long or shorter even. But anyway, we're trying to appeal to what the public wants. So we're shortening the length of our lectures, or at least we're trying to. And so that's about all we have for today. Again, I'm Scott Powers Houston. This is Learning with Power, and episode 31. And be sure to like, share, subscribe, tell all your friends about it if you like what you're hearing here, if you're learning or you find this interesting. And please stick with us, and we'll see you next time. We'll see you then. Take care. Bye.